I was standing in the middle of the living room, my phone flashlight aimed at the tiny black dot in the corner of the smoke detector, and my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might actually throw up. The red recording light was off, but that didn't matter. I knew exactly what it was, and my hands started shaking so violently I almost dropped my phone. A hidden camera. In the Airbnb I'd been renting for the last 3 nights. And the worst part? I had no idea how many more there might be, or what they'd already seen. My mind was racing, my pulse hammering in my ears, and all I could think was, how much of my life in the last 72 hours had been recorded without my consent? And who was watching? That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just creepy. This was illegal. And I was alone in a stranger's house with proof that someone had been secretly watching me. 3 nights earlier, when I'd arrived at the cozy cottage getaway I'd booked for a week-long work trip, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The listing had glowing reviews, a rustic vibe in the pictures, and the host, Mark, seemed friendly enough in our short message exchange. I'd been looking forward to some peace and quiet, a break from the constant noise of my apartment in the city, and a chance to finally get ahead on my project without distractions. The house was tucked away at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees and just enough distance from the nearest neighbor to make it feel private. Too private, I would later realize. The first night, I cooked dinner, streamed a movie on my laptop, and went to bed early. No strange sounds, no weird vibes. Just silence. The second night, though, I noticed something odd while I was on a video call with my sister. She made a joke about my fancy Airbnb and said, "It looks like you're in a security showroom." I laughed it off, but later that evening I started to notice the number of smoke detectors in the house. There was one in the kitchen, one in the hallway, one in the living room, and another in the bedroom. Seemed normal at first, safety and all that. But when I lay in bed scrolling through my phone before sleeping, I glanced up and realized the detector above me looked off. The little opening where smoke should enter seemed covered, but there was a pinhole in the center. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was just an unusual model, and eventually fell asleep. By the third day, that uneasy feeling had settled in like a weight on my chest. I decided to take a closer look, just to quiet my paranoia. That's when I stood on a chair in the living room and aimed my flashlight into the detector. And saw it. The faint glint of a camera lens, buried inside. My legs went weak. My brain immediately flipped into panic mode. What if there were more? What if there was audio? What if someone was watching live right now? Every instinct in my body screamed to get out, but I also knew I needed proof. Proof that this wasn't just a mistake or a weird smoke detector design. That's when I made the worst decision of the entire ordeal. I didn't leave. I stayed. I told myself I just needed to check the rest of the house quickly, then I'd pack my bag and leave. But my legs felt like they were moving through wet cement as I carried the chair from room to room, my phone flashlight cutting through the warm, cozy lighting that now felt sinister. In the bedroom, I stood on the chair again, hands trembling so much I almost dropped the detector when I twisted it off the ceiling. Inside, tucked where no one would ever casually look, was another tiny lens. My throat went dry. The kitchen had one too. That made 3 cameras, all hidden inside devices meant to keep people safe. I kept thinking about the shower. My skin crawled at the thought, but I forced myself to check the bathroom. No detector there, but my eyes scanned every corner, every tile, the towel rack, the light fixture. When I crouched to look under the sink, I found something that made my chest seize, a small black object taped to the back wall, angled toward the shower. It looked like a phone charger. It wasn't. The tiny circle at the end told me it was another camera. I backed out so fast I smacked my head on the cabinet door. My breathing was loud and ragged, echoing off the tile. The thought slammed into me like a truck. I had been showering here, sleeping here, changing here. Whoever set these up had seen everything. And there was no way to know where that footage was now. I grabbed my bag and shoved my laptop, charger, and toiletries inside, moving fast, but trying to keep my hands steady enough to zip it shut. I didn't want to call the host. I didn't want to give him any warning. My mind was already spiraling through possibilities. What if he showed up? What if he was outside right now? I pressed myself against the front window, peeking through the blinds. The gravel driveway was empty, but that didn't calm me. I had no idea where he lived. I decided to get to my car, drive to the nearest police station, and let them deal with it. But as I stepped onto the porch, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. "Hey, just checking in. Everything good at the house?" My stomach flipped. He'd never messaged me mid-stay before. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct screamed not to answer, but I typed back, "Yes, all fine, thanks." My hands were sweating. If he suspected I knew, I didn't want him to try and stop me. I locked the door behind me and walked quickly to my car, scanning the tree line. The air felt colder than it had that morning, sharp against my skin. I got in, started the engine, and pulled out without looking back. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a small-town police station, explaining everything to an officer who kept glancing at the bag of smoke detectors and the charger camera I'd brought with me. He took notes, asked for the listing information, and said they'd need to get a warrant to search the rest of the property. When I asked if they'd contact Airbnb, he nodded. "And the host," he added. My stomach knotted at the thought. I imagined Mark reading that message from the police, realizing exactly who had reported him. "Do you think he's watching live?" I asked quietly. The officer looked at me for a long moment before saying, "If he is, he knows you're here now." That sentence stuck in my head long after I left. The officer told me they'd keep me updated, but for now, I should find somewhere else to stay. I nodded, though the idea of sleeping anywhere alone that night made my skin crawl. I drove to a cheap roadside motel, one with flickering neon lights and carpets that smelled faintly of cigarettes, but at least it felt impersonal, like no one cared enough about me to put a camera in the ceiling. Still, I checked. I pulled the curtains tight, scanned every vent, even took apart the smoke detector before I let myself sit on the bed. My laptop sat closed on the desk, and I couldn't bring myself to open it. I kept thinking about the footage, if they had it, where it might end up. How many strangers could already have seen me? I barely slept. The next afternoon, my phone rang. It was the same officer from the station. His tone was calm but carried a weight that made my stomach twist. "Miss Carter, we executed the warrant this morning. We found multiple recording devices throughout the property, more than the ones you brought in." I asked how many. There was a pause, then, 15. My hand went cold around the phone. 15 cameras. In a house barely bigger than my apartment. "We also found a locked storage room," he continued. "It contained computer equipment and several external hard drives. We'll be sending them to the lab for analysis." I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the stain on the carpet like it could anchor me. Then I asked the question I didn't want the answer to: was there anyone else staying there before me? Another pause. "Yes. The last 4 guests before you all stayed alone." The weight in my chest grew heavier. I thought of all the people who'd slept in that bedroom, showered in that bathroom, completely unaware. "And the host?" I asked. "Mark Thompson," the officer said. "He wasn't at the property when we arrived, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. We've put out a notice to locate him." My throat went dry. He was gone. I couldn't decide if that made me feel safer or worse. That night, I kept my motel door double-locked and the chair wedged under the handle. Every sound from the hallway made me sit up. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. 30 seconds later, a text appeared. "You didn't have to do that." I stared at the text until the words blurred, my thumb hovering over the screen as if some better response might materialize if I waited long enough. But all I could manage was a screenshot for the case file and a single line back to the officer. He texted me from an unknown number. Within a minute he replied, "Do not engage. Forward the message and block the number." I did as told, but blocking did nothing for the way my heart ricocheted inside my chest, or for the feeling that the room's thin curtains were suddenly transparent. I dragged the dresser in front of the door, then told myself to breathe, count, reset. This was still a motel on a state highway, not a cabin in the woods, and fear didn't change the square footage. 5 minutes later, another unknown number lit my phone with a voicemail notification. No ring this time, just that jaundiced dot asking to be tapped. I forwarded it to the officer without listening, then put the phone face down like it might bite. Sleep was a rumor I'd heard of once. By morning, I decided I needed daylight, other people, normalcy. I showered with the curtain open, checked the vent, the mirror, and the plug-in alarm clock just in case, then walked to the lobby for burnt coffee and a waffle that tasted like cardboard comfort. The TV above the cereal dispensers was tuned to local news. A ticker crawled by about a rental property investigation, no names, just the kind of vagueness that makes your skin prickle because you know the blinks. Back in my room, I opened my laptop with a flinch and messaged Airbnb support again, attaching the police report number, the photos of the cameras, and the officer's contact info. The rep's replies were gentle and formatted and mostly useless. They were deeply concerned. They were escalating to trust and safety. They were here for me. I asked point-blank whether the listing was suspended. The answer took 10 minutes and arrived with a carefully worded yes. A small, hollow win. I called my sister next. I had delayed telling her the worst of it because I knew the tone she used when she was scared for me. Hearing it would make the fear real. Today I told her everything, all the way down to the part where I stood on a chair and saw the glassy wink of a lens inside a smoke detector, and she went quiet before she said, "Come stay with me. Please. I'll drive to get you." I almost said yes, but the thought of 2 hours on the interstate while my brain played movies of who might be following made me say I'd think about it after I checked out another hotel closer to downtown, somewhere with cameras in the lobby for once. At noon, I moved to a chain business hotel with a front desk that actually asked for ID and a parking garage that smelled like wet concrete and safety. At check-in, I asked for a room on a floor with other guests, not a lonely corner, and the clerk nodded like he'd been asked for stranger comforts. In the elevator, I watched myself in the mirror tiles and tried to memorize a version of my face that didn't twitch at phantom sounds. The room itself was beige and forgettable, my new favorite aesthetic. I unpacked only what I needed, then called the officer to say I'd changed hotels and asked, almost apologetically, whether I could listen to the voicemail he'd had me forward. He said they'd already pulled it and that it was mostly intimidation. A voice disguiser over a man's cadence saying, "You made a mistake. This is going to be complicated now." My breath shortened despite the reassurance, so he added that my number had been flagged, calls traced, and that if contact continued they'd request a harassment order. He reminded me again not to respond to unknowns. That afternoon, with nothing to do but wait and the waiting turning my thoughts toxic, I forced myself into action that had edges and outcomes. I bought 2 inexpensive camera finders online for future trips. I read 3 articles on how to spot pinhole lenses and IR LEDs. I made a short list called Control What You Can Use Hotel Safes, Cover Peepholes, Scan Wi-Fi Networks for Strange Devices, Check Mirrors with a Light. It felt like building a fence after the break-in, but fences still matter. Around 5 my email pinged. Airbnb Trust and Safety wrote that they had permanently removed the listing, suspended the host account, and would cooperate with law enforcement. They also offered to cover my hotel costs for the remainder of my trip and provided information on their support line if I needed counseling. I stared at that last sentence longer than I expected. There's a kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones after someone takes a piece of your privacy. You don't sleep it off. You metabolize it slowly, molar by molar, until one day you realize you can taste food again. I ordered room service and tried to watch half a sitcom with the volume down, but my phone buzzed with an email notification from an address that wasn't quite nonsense. A string, then mark, then more string. Subject line empty. No body text, only an attachment named invoice.pdf. My skin went cold. I forwarded it to the officer and did not open it. 10 minutes later he called to say good job, do not click, they'd analyze it in a sandbox. He also told me the lab had started imaging the hard drives, that preliminary indexes suggested structured storage, directories per guest, dates stamped, device names, and that they would contact anyone identifiable. I sat very still while he said that. If there's material of you, he added carefully, we'll handle it as evidence and you'll have control over any decisions that involve your likeness. It was the closest anyone could get to promising me safety about a thing that wasn't safe. After we hung up, I called my boss to explain a sanitized version, rental nightmare, police involved. I'll still hit my deadline, but I'm shifting to remote, and she responded like a decent human. Told me to expense what I needed and to take tomorrow if my brain was soup. I said I'd be fine. Then I turned off the TV, sat on the carpet with my back against the bed, and let my mind unspool only as far as it could without snapping. I pictured the cottage not as a violation scene, but as a blueprint, and I walked through it in my head, marking each unnatural eye. When my phone buzzed again, it was a calendar alert I'd forgotten to delete. Sunset hike, lookout point. I laughed once, an ugly sound. Instead, I went downstairs to the lobby, sat where other people breathed, and wrote a note to myself in the phone's app that read, "You did the right thing. You are not alone. Keep choosing daylight." On the way back up, I noticed one of those wall-mounted convex mirrors at the end of the corridor, the kind that helps housekeeping see around blind corners, and for a second the world tilted. I waited for my heart to slow, then made myself walk past it without looking away. Halfway to my room, a housekeeping cart turned the corner with a squeak, and the woman pushing it smiled and said, "Evening," in the ordinary way humans do when the world is not a conspiracy, and that small normal thing became a wedge that held the door open for air. I slept with the bedside lamp on and still woke twice, listening for nothing in particular. At 6:12 a.m., my phone vibrated with a new email from the officer. They'd identified at least 2 live streaming endpoints configured on the cottage's network, but they appeared to be offline now. They had also found fragments of cached thumbnails likely generated by a monitoring interface. He didn't attach examples, just wrote, "We're working on chain of custody and warrants for the upstream service." "You're doing everything right." I whispered, "Okay," into the quiet room like he could hear me. Then I opened the curtains and let the sun in, because light is proof, and because I needed a reason to believe this would end with me walking out the other side hole. By late morning, I developed a ritual. Sit at the desk, keep the curtains open to prove the day exists, refresh my email like a metronome, and pretend that waiting was a task with a deliverable. At 10:43, the officer called with the kind of clipped cadence that means he's reading while he speaks. The lab had mounted 2 of the drives. There were folder trees labeled by month, subfolders named with booking initials. Within those, time-stamped segments that looked like motion-triggered clips. He said alleged 3 times and chain of custody twice, and I appreciated his legal scaffolding because it kept my feelings from spilling. Then he added something that made the room tilt. They had already identified at least 1 prior guest who had filed a vague complaint months ago. Odd noises, uncomfortable, no proof. Who was now willing to speak on the record after hearing from them this morning? "You're not alone," he said, and for a moment my throat closed, because being the first to step forward had felt like walking out onto thin ice, while everyone else watched from shore. After we hung up, an email landed from a victim advocate at the department, soft language wrapped around concrete steps. They could connect me with counseling, explain my rights, outline how evidence access works if I needed to review anything for identification, and brief me on protective measures if contact escalated. Attached was a 1-page primer titled "Surveillance Crime: What Happens Next," and I read it all the way through, both grateful and a little angry that such a document existed because it meant there were enough of us to deserve a template. Airbnb wrote again too, this time from a person with a last name and a direct line. They'd initiated refunds for the entire stay, covered the hotel invoice I uploaded, and offered to reimburse reasonable costs for device scanners I'd purchased. They also asked, delicately, whether I was open to talking to their trust and safety investigator. I said yes, with the officer CC'd. It felt important that everyone stood in the same room, even if that room was just a subject line. Around noon, the advocate called. Her voice carried the kind of steady that lives under waves. She walked me through what cooperation could look like if the case moved forward, no surprises, options, agency at every step, and then did a thing no script requires. She asked if I'd eaten. I said yes automatically and only afterward realized the answer was a lie. I took the elevator down to the lobby cafe, bought a sandwich I didn't want, and sat near the window where humans passed like weather. When my phone buzzed again, it was a new number, but this time the caller ID said, "Private Attorney." The woman introduced herself as counsel retained by Airbnb to liaise with victims. clarified she did not represent me, but could explain civil avenues if I wished. She spoke cleanly about words I knew from television: injunctions, damages, settlement, and then parked her sentences in a cul-de-sac of patience. I told her I wasn't ready for the language of money. "Understood," she said. "When you are, we'll still be here." After lunch, I walked 2 blocks just to hear my shoes be ordinary on the sidewalk. It was a bright day that could have belonged to any errand, and the normalcy wrapped me in something almost like okay. On the way back, I doubled a corner and froze. A man stood across the street wearing a baseball cap and a too-neutral jacket, looking down at his phone. From the shape of him, from the way my fear stitched threads out of shadows, I decided he was Mark. He didn't glance up. I took 3 steps backward, ducked into a pharmacy, and stood in the aisle with toothpaste like a talisman. When my hands stopped fizzing, I paid for mints I didn't need and asked the clerk, as casual as I could, whether the hotel got many reporters lately. She blinked. "Reporters?" I shook my head. "Never mind." Back upstairs, I told myself to disassemble the thought before it set like cement. The officer had warned me about this part too. After a violation, the world gives you false positives. Hypervigilance is a survival tool, but it misfires. I wrote that sentence down because I needed instructions I could read when my chest forgot. At 3, the trust and safety investigator called with the Airbnb attorney on the line and the officer listening quietly. The investigator's questions were measured: timeline, access, messages with the host, every detail of what I saw and when. He never rushed, and he didn't step around the word camera. He told me they had an internal team scouring reviews for coded language, oddly placed smoke detectors, too many electronics, weird buzzing, and they were contacting any guest with signals. Hearing the pattern spoken aloud was equal parts horrifying and validating. Horror, because this wasn't a fluke. Validating, because my brain had been working overtime to convince me I'd overreacted. After the call, I opened my laptop for something that wasn't crisis. I worked for an hour on the spreadsheet I'd promised my boss, numbers clean and quiet, a universe where inputs led to outputs and nothing filmed you breathing. When I finished, an email waited from the officer with a short update. They had obtained a preservation order for a third-party streaming service, and IP at the cottage had pinged. The service had acknowledged receipt. He also included a single line that read, "One prior guest wants to talk to you if you're open. Completely your choice." I stared at the sentence until it stopped looking like letters and started looking like a hand. Then I typed back that I was willing, with boundaries, phone only, first names, and he should sit on the call. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. The officer patched her in. She introduced herself as Kay, voice careful as a full glass. She'd stayed there in early spring alone. She hadn't found anything then, just unease. She left after 2 nights, wrote a neutral review because she couldn't put her finger on it, and that had haunted her more than the stay. Hearing her say, "I thought I was crazy," felt like looking in a mirror someone finally cleaned. We talked for half an hour about nothing and everything: the layout of the house, the ridiculous number of detectors, the way the bedroom felt watched even with the blinds shut. Before we hung up, she said, "Thank you for doing what I couldn't," and I almost told her not to thank me because courage feels like an accident until you name it. At dusk, I went down to the lobby again so the sky could change in public. The TV was on a local station. A 2-minute segment ran with a blurred photo of the cottage and the words, "Hidden devices found." No names, no location specifics, just enough to let the town know a line had been crossed. People in the lounge looked up, then back to their phones. The world is so capable of holding your worst day and continuing with its coffee. Back in my room, I finally ate the rest of the sandwich, then opened notes and wrote a list called, "After, change passwords, freeze credit, ask the officer how long they hold data, schedule therapy." Buy opaque tape for laptop cameras, not because it helps here, but because rituals soothe. My phone vibrated with a text from my sister, a picture of her cat looking judgmental, the caption, "Come stay. He'll allow it." I smiled for the first time in days. I told her soon. Then I set an alarm for morning and made a plan. Meet the officer to sign a formal victim statement, ask about a harassment order if the messages continued, and, this was the hard part, Request to be notified before anyone even asked me to view anything recovered. I wanted control over my own eyes. As I turned off the lamp, the city hummed its indifferent lullaby beyond the window, and for the first time since the cottage, I felt the possibility of sleep glide toward me like a cautious animal. Just before I drifted, my phone pulsed once with an email subject that slid like ice. We need to talk about what we found. I woke up instantly alert, my heart already pounding before my eyes even focused on the glowing subject line. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, the rest of the inbox a blur, my brain cataloging all the ways we need to talk about what we found could end badly. I checked the sender. It was from the officer, not some anonymous account. Still, I braced myself before opening it. The message was brief. We have identified you in some of the recovered footage. Nothing explicit, but you should be prepared to discuss how to proceed. Call me when you can. My stomach knotted so tightly it felt like it might snap. The words "nothing explicit" were supposed to be a comfort, I guessed, but the idea that there was any footage with me in it made my skin crawl. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in my hand, willing myself to call right away before I had too much time to think. When he picked up, the officer's tone was the same steady calm as always, but there was a hint of something heavier underneath. He explained that the files were arranged in sequences by day and time, some containing motion-triggered clips in the living room and kitchen. I appeared in a few, fully clothed, working on my laptop, cooking, but the angles made it obvious the cameras weren't there for security. We'll keep all copies secured, he said, and none of it leaves evidence custody without your consent or a court order. I nodded, forgetting he couldn't see me. We're also continuing to identify other guests, he added. Some have already confirmed they're willing to testify if it comes to trial. It should have made me feel stronger, part of something bigger than just my own fear. Instead, I felt small. This wasn't only about my privacy anymore, it was about all of us. The violation was collective. I asked if they had found anything about where the footage had been streamed. He hesitated, then said they were working with a warrant for the streaming service. We have strong reason to believe the host had live access, possibly sharing with others, he said. My hands clenched. The thought of someone, somewhere, watching me in real time, without me even knowing, sent a flash of heat up my spine. By the afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled at the police department to review the official statement and sign documents for the case file. Before I left the hotel, I found myself checking my reflection twice, not because I cared how I looked, but because I wanted to make sure nothing about me said "shaken victim." When I arrived, they led me to a small interview room with pale blue walls, a table, and 2 chairs. The officer went over the statement slowly, line by line, making sure everything was accurate. Then he asked, "Do you want to see the clips?" I froze. Every part of me wanted to say no. But another part, the part that hated not knowing, made me ask how bad they were. "Nothing you need to see right now," he said. "They're mundane, but they confirm the devices weren't for safety. I think preserving your distance from them for now is the healthier choice." I agreed. As I signed the papers, the officer mentioned that Mark still hadn't been located. There was a suspicion he might have left the state, possibly even under another identity. Driving back to the hotel, I felt the paranoia creeping in again. Every man in a baseball cap at the crosswalk, every driver glancing at me in traffic, seemed like him. I hated that he still had that power, even if it was only in my mind. When I reached my room, I locked the door, threw the latch, and sat on the bed with my laptop. An email from the Airbnb investigator waited in my inbox, saying they were coordinating with police to identify any accounts that had accessed the live streams. If they find them and they find names, I thought, this could become a much bigger case. That night, the city outside my window felt different, louder somehow, the hum of traffic like a reminder that life was still moving, even as mine felt stuck in this slow, tense orbit. My phone buzzed once just before midnight. No number, no text, just a single image attachment, a grainy screenshot of me in the cottage kitchen, pouring coffee. I stared at the image until my vision tunneled. It was unmistakably me, same sweater, same chipped blue mug I'd found in the cottage cabinet, but the angle wasn't one I'd seen in any of the photos I'd taken for the police. My pulse roared in my ears as I zoomed in, tracing the blurred edges of the frame. It wasn't a still from the ceiling smoke detector or the vent camera. This was lower, more horizontal, almost like it had been shot from across the kitchen island. Which meant either there had been another device I'd missed entirely, or someone had been in the house. My first instinct was to call the officer right away, but my hand shook so badly I could barely tap the screen. When he answered, his voice sharpened at the sound of mine. I forwarded the image immediately. There was a long silence before he spoke. "This wasn't in the evidence set we recovered," he said finally. "Which means it came from somewhere else." My skin prickled. "Like from his phone?" I asked. "Possibly," he said. "Or from someone he sent it to." The thought that someone, maybe more than one person, still had access to me in that moment made me curl in on myself. The officer told me to stay put and keep the door locked. A unit would come by to collect my phone for forensics and give me a temporary replacement. Within half an hour, 2 plainclothes detectives were at my door. They took the device carefully, bagged it, and handed me a sealed loaner phone with the department's number preloaded. "If anything comes through to this one, call us immediately," one of them said. Their faces were kind but taut, like they were holding back how bad this might be. When they left, the room felt too quiet, the muted hum of the AC suddenly loud enough to make me jump. I tried to distract myself with TV, but every face on the screen seemed to stare too directly. I ordered room service just to hear another human voice at the door, even though I barely touched the food. Every few minutes, my mind replayed the same thought. He's still out there, and he's still watching me. Around 10 p.m., the loaner phone rang. It was the officer again. They'd traced the email to an IP in this city, logged just hours before it hit my inbox. "We can't confirm it's him," he said, "but if it is, he's close." He told me they'd be adding extra patrols in the area and would move me to a different hotel under a pseudonym for my own safety. I packed in 15 frantic minutes, checking every corner of the room like something might leap out. The officer met me in the lobby with another detective, and we drove in silence to a more upscale hotel across town. This one had cameras in the hallways, keycard access to elevators, and a front desk clerk who didn't even glance up from his monitor when I walked in. A blessing. My new room was on the 12th floor, with a view of the river and no buildings close enough to see in. Still, I kept the curtain shut. Just before I tried to sleep, the new phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nice view from up here." For a few seconds, I just stared at the message, my heart refusing to beat until the meaning landed like a fist. Up here. It wasn't a generic threat. He was referencing my exact floor, my view, my now. I felt the walls close in around me. My fingers trembled as I forwarded the text to the officer with just 2 words: "He's here." He called back immediately. "Do not move away from the door. We're on our way. Keep the phone line open." I pressed my back to the wall farthest from the window, as if distance alone could make me invisible. Every sound from the hallway, a cart rolling, muffled laughter, scraped my nerves raw. Within minutes, there was a knock, not from him but from the officer, identifying himself by name and badge through the door before I even reached it. I opened to find him and 2 uniformed officers standing there, faces set like stone. They moved in quickly, one staying with me while the others split off, one to review security footage, another to speak to the front desk. The officer with me kept his voice low. "If he's really in the building, we'll find him. These hotels log every keycard use, and there are cameras on each floor." Not 10 minutes later, the radio on his shoulder crackled. A voice I didn't know said, "We've got someone matching the description, 12th floor, east stairwell. Headed down." The officer's jaw tightened. He told me to stay in the room, then slipped out. I locked the door the second it closed, my pulse so loud it was hard to hear anything else. I stood there listening to faint echoes of movement in the hallway, then the heavier sound of running footsteps in the stairwell beyond. 5 minutes later, the officer returned, his face a mask of controlled frustration. "He bolted," he said. "We saw him on camera, but he avoided the lobby, exited through the parking garage on foot. Security's pulling all the angles now." My stomach sank. "So it was him?" I asked. He nodded once. "We're 90% sure. Same build, same jacket as in the original Airbnb profile photo, minus the cap. He knew where you were and he wanted you to know." The rest of the night was a blur of statements, reviewing footage frame by frame, and a promise from hotel security that they'd increase patrols on my floor. But even with all the reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thin walls of this room weren't protection. They were just a boundary he hadn't decided to cross yet. Lying in the dark, I thought about that first moment in the cottage when I'd spotted the glint of the hidden lens, how I'd convinced myself that reporting it would end the fear. Now I understood the truth. The physical cameras could be removed, but the sense of being watched lived on, just beneath the skin. And somewhere out there, maybe in the city, maybe just a floor below, Mark still had eyes on me. The idea came from the officer, and I hated it instantly. "Absolutely not," I said before he'd even finished explaining. But he kept his voice calm, deliberate, almost like he was talking me through a breathing exercise. "We won't put you in harm's way. You won't be alone for a single second. But right now, he's in control. He chooses the time, the place, the contact. If we flip that, we can end this before it escalates further." The plan was simple on paper. I'd stay in my current hotel room, but under surveillance, not his, ours. 2 undercover officers would be stationed in the room next door, another in the hallway disguised as a maintenance worker, and the rest monitoring the lobby and stairwells. My phone would remain active to bait him into making contact again. It felt invasive, even though I knew the intrusion this time was for my safety. Still, when they began setting up, watching them mount small black domes in the corners and string fiber cables discreetly along the baseboards, it was hard not to flash back to the cottage. How many times had he stood in a room, calmly installing a lens like this, thinking no one would notice? I gripped the arm of the chair and forced myself to remember the difference. These people were here to protect me, not exploit me. By nightfall, the room was wired. One of the officers, a woman named Ramirez, stayed with me as the others took their positions. She had the kind of calm energy you want in a storm, alert, but not brittle. We kept the lights on, the curtains half open, and the TV running at a comfortable volume, trying to make the scene look casual. At 9:12 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My throat went dry. "Thought you'd try to hide higher up." Ramirez's eyes met mine, and she gave the smallest nod before speaking into her concealed mic. Within seconds, a reply came in from the officer in the lobby. "Got a male matching description entering elevator. 12th floor, button pressed." My pulse spiked. The elevator ride would take maybe 20 seconds, 30 if he stopped. I heard it before I saw it, the soft chime down the hall, the muted roll of footsteps on carpet, then a knock. Not the aggressive pounding I'd feared, but a slow, deliberate rhythm. Ramirez whispered, "Don't answer. He's about to walk into frame." I stayed frozen in the chair, every muscle locked. Through the peephole, the camera captured his face, unshaven, eyes scanning the hallway, that same too-neutral jacket. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a phone, and started typing. A second later, my screen lit up. "Smile for me." That was the cue. Officers converged from both ends of the hallway. He looked up just in time to see them close in. For a split second, his body tensed like he might run, but there was nowhere to go. 2 officers grabbed his arms, another relieved him of the phone. Ramirez opened the door only after they had him cuffed, his expression flipping between rage and something like disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that the game had ended. They led him down the hallway, past my door. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the air in my lungs expand without resistance. But even as I watched him disappear into the elevator flanked by uniforms, a thought crawled in at the edges. Capturing him didn't erase the footage he'd already taken. Somewhere, out there, parts of me still existed in files I might never see or delete. 2 days after the arrest, the officer called to tell me Mark was being held without bail, at least until the preliminary hearing. It should have felt like a victory, and in a way, it did. The constant edge-of-seat paranoia had eased. The shadows in the corners weren't quite as loud. But then he said, "We've gone through the rest of the recovered devices. There's something you should know before the media does." My grip on the phone tightened. They had cataloged hundreds of hours of footage, some dating back years. At least 12 confirmed victims, possibly more, all unknowingly recorded in different properties he'd listed online under various names. Some of the clips were mundane, like mine. Others weren't. The officer's voice softened when he said, "You don't need to see them unless you want to, but you should understand the scope." I told him I didn't. I didn't need those images burned into my head alongside my own. Later that night, I sat in my hotel room, still under a temporary stay until the trial, and opened my laptop. There were emails from other victims who'd gotten my contact through the advocate, all of them thanking me for pushing the case forward. Some shared their stories in detail, others just wrote, "I thought I was alone." Reading them, I realized the weight wasn't just mine, it was something we all carried, different shapes of the same shadow. Airbnb reached out one final time to confirm that all of his accounts had been permanently banned and that they were introducing new inspection protocols for properties. It was supposed to be reassuring, but all I could think about was how many hosts might have done the same thing and just never been caught. The night before the hearing, I walked to the river and sat on a bench, the city lights blurring in the water. I thought about how quickly an ordinary trip could twist into something you carry for the rest of your life. How a single choice, clicking book now, had set off a chain of events I couldn't have imagined. And I wondered what justice really looked like in cases like this. Was it putting him behind bars? Destroying every copy of the footage? Or was it simply knowing I'd never again ignore that gut feeling, no matter how small? The next morning, I stood in court with the others, strangers linked by a violation we hadn't asked for. When they read the charges aloud, Mark didn't look at us. Maybe that was his last power play, denying us even the recognition of our presence. But as the judge ordered him remanded for trial, I felt something shift, not closure exactly, but the first step toward it. Even now, I don't know if every file he made will be found. I don't know if everyone in those clips will ever know they were there. And maybe that's the part that will always keep me up some nights. But I do know this, if I'd kept quiet, he'd still be out there, finding new walls to hide behind, new people to watch. So I'll ask you, if you were in my place, would you want to see what they recorded, or would you choose to never know?